October 1972. High in the Andes, the survivors of a plane crash huddle around a small radio and hear the search for them being called off. They are being declared dead while they sit there listening. Only 16 of the 45 people on that flight will make it home alive. That story became an Oscar-nominated film, and what if I told you it's not even close to the darkest one in this video? Welcome to Volume 3 of the most disturbing movies based on real events. This time, we are leaving America completely, and the cases only got worse. A serial killer in a police lab set free by mistake. A massacre a government denied for 50 years straight. And at the very bottom, a family living in paradise, one wall away from a death camp. As always, before we start, real people lived these stories, and we're going to treat every one of them with respect. This is all for educational purposes. Let's get into it. Level 1. Society of the Snow. You probably know the basic story. In October 1972, a plane carrying a Uruguayan rugby team crashed high in the Andes, and the survivors stayed alive only by consuming the remains of those who had died. That one sentence is how most people know it. The 2023 film finally told it from the inside, and it's so much worse than the sentence. Flight 571 left with 45 people on board, mostly the Old Christians Rugby Club and their families. On October 13th, in heavy cloud, the pilot began his descent too early and clipped a ridge at around 4,200 meters. The wings and tail tore off, and the fuselage slid down a glacier like a sled. 12 people died almost immediately. The rest were stranded at freezing altitude with a few chocolate bars and no way to call for help. But here is where the real nightmare starts. On the 8th day, huddled around a tiny radio, they heard a broadcast say the search for them had been called off. They were being declared dead while they listened. That was when it truly sank in that nobody was coming. And then, on the 16th day, an avalanche buried the fuselage in the night and killed 13 more, people who had already survived the crash. Out of food and out of hope, they agreed the living could use the bodies of the dead to stay alive. Some refused and didn't make it. In the end, two of them, Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa, climbed out over the mountains for about 10 days until they found a Chilean farmer across a river, and Parado threw him a note wrapped around a rock that began, "I come from a plane that fell in the mountains." 16 of the original 45 walked out after 72 days. Every one of them went on to rebuild a life, and the Catholic Church never once condemned what they had done to survive. A simple cross still stands in that valley today for the 29 who never came down. Mesrine. If you're not French, you may never have heard this name, but in France, Jacques Mesrine was a household word. The two-part film from 2008 tells the life of the man the press called Public Enemy Number 1 and the man of 1,000 faces. Mesrine was a bank robber, a kidnapper, and a killer, but what made him a legend was that he treated crime like theater. He robbed banks, sometimes 2 in a day. He broke out of prison more than once, including a famous escape from a Paris prison with smuggled guns and a grappling hook over the wall. In his own autobiography, he claimed around 40 killings, though, and this matters, experts believe he wildly exaggerated that to build his own myth. Only a handful were ever confirmed. But here's the part that turned him from a criminal into a symbol. While he was the single most wanted man in France, he didn't hide. He gave interviews to journalists, and in 1978, he posed for the cover of Paris Match, the country's biggest magazine, essentially taunting the police. He was writing his own legend in real time, and the state clearly decided it had had enough. So here's how it ended. In November 1979, police ambushed him at the Porte de Clignancourt in Paris. Officers hidden under a tarp on a truck opened fire on his car without warning and killed him where he sat. There was no arrest, no order to surrender. It was essentially a public execution on a city street. His girlfriend in the car beside him survived but lost an eye. Today, Mesrine has been dead for over 40 years, and France still argues about that morning. His autobiography pushed the country to pass a law making sure criminals could not profit from selling their own crimes, and yet he never really went away. In France, he remains, controversially, a folk hero figure, the outlaw the state chose to gun down rather than capture. Touching the Void. Touching the Void, a documentary from 2003, is still one of the most intense survival stories ever put to film. Two British climbers, Joe Simpson and Simon Yates, went up a mountain called Ciula Grande in the Peruvian Andes in 1985, and a single broken rope stood between one of them and a very lonely death. They made the first ever climb of the mountain's unclimbed west face, which should have been the whole story. But coming down, Simpson fell and shattered his right leg, a catastrophic break that, at altitude and in a storm, is usually a death sentence. Yates refused to accept it and began lowering his partner down the mountain, about 90 meters at a time, in the dark, unable to see or hear him. But here is where it becomes a nightmare. On one of those lowers, Yates unknowingly sent Simpson over the edge of a cliff, leaving him hanging in mid-air over a huge drop, unable to climb the rope or signal up. Yates, freezing and being dragged off the mountain himself by the weight, held on as long as his body would let him, and then made the most debated decision in mountaineering history. He took out his knife and cut the rope. Simpson dropped into a deep crevasse and, against all odds, survived. Yates, certain he had just killed his friend, climbed down to base camp alone. And then Simpson did the thing almost nobody believes. Trapped, unable to climb up, he chose to lower himself further down into the dark, toward what he assumed was his own death, gambling there might be a way out at the bottom. There was. Then he crawled and hopped on a shattered leg for about 3 days across a glacier, delirious and starving, and reached base camp just hours before Yates was going to pack up and leave for good. So here is the question the film leaves you with. Do you think Simon Yates was a coward for cutting that rope, or was it the only reason both of those men are alive today? That was only level 1, and we're barely scratching the surface. As we go deeper, the disasters stop being accidents and start being choices people made on purpose. Stay with me until the final level, because what is waiting at the very bottom is a genocide the whole world watched and walked away from, and one prisoner of war who did one thing almost nobody could. He forgave the man who tortured him. Level 2. The 33. In August 2010, the whole world watched a hole in the Chilean desert for over 2 months, waiting to see if 33 men were still alive at the bottom of it. The 2015 film tells their story. What softens it is why they were down there at all. On August 5th, the San Jose copper and gold mine near Copiapo collapsed. 34 men were underground. 1 got out. The other 33 men trapped 700 meters down, about 5 kilometers from the entrance, sealed in by a piece of mountain. According to the investigations, the emergency escape ladder that was legally required in the refuge shaft simply wasn't there, which killed any chance of climbing out. So they waited in the dark, rationing their food down to 2 spoonfuls of tuna every 48 hours. Now here is what still makes me angry. For 17 days, the outside world had no idea if a single one of them was alive. Then a drill finally punched through, and when it was pulled back up, there was a note taped to the bit. It read, "Estamos bien en el refugio, los 33. We are fine in the shelter, the 33 of us." That note set off one of the biggest rescue operations in history, and on October 13th, after 69 days underground, all 33 came up alive, one at a time in a narrow capsule. And then the story the cameras loved just quietly ended. According to the investigation that closed in 2013, the company had ignored safety warnings for years. The mine was known to be unstable, and 8 people had already died in its accidents in the years before. Despite all of it, no one was ever charged. Many of the 33 came home to unemployment, PTSD, and promises of a better life that never arrived. The world watched them come out of the ground like a miracle, and then, almost as fast as it showed up, looked away and left them to figure out the rest alone. Gomorrah. Gomorrah from 2008 is about an entire criminal system. It's based on the book by Roberto Saviano, who went undercover into the Gomorrah, the organized crime network around Naples, Italy. And the reason it feels so real is that Saviano was not making any of it up. Forget the idea of one single organized mafia. The Gomorrah is over 100 clans, constantly at war with each other. The film follows several true-to-life threads at once, including a real gang war in the Scampia housing projects that killed dozens of people in a matter of months. According to Saviano's investigation, the Gomorrah had killed around 4,000 people over about 30 years, more than most terrorist organizations. But here is what makes this so much worse than a normal gangster story. The deadliest thing the Gomorrah ever did had nothing to do with guns. One of the clan's biggest businesses was taking toxic waste from factories in the wealthy north of Italy, chemicals, asbestos, dioxins, and illegally burying it under the farmland and water of their own region. The area became known as the Land of Fires, from the waste being set alight in the fields at night. They made billions while quietly seeding a cancer epidemic into the ground their own families lived on. And this is where it stops being history and becomes the present. Roberto Saviano wrote a book, and for that, the clan sentenced him to death. He has now lived under 24-hour armed guard since 2006, almost 20 years. He moves constantly, has no real private life, and can't simply walk down a street in the country he wrote about. The gunmen can be arrested, but the chemicals are still in the soil, still in the water, and the illnesses they cause are still turning up in people who were not even born when the waste went into the ground. It's a war that keeps killing long after its soldiers are gone. Talvar. Talvar from 2015 is an Indian film about a real case that tore the country apart, the 2008 Noida double murder. And it is unusual because it barely spends any time asking who did it. The real question of this film is why we may never know. On the night of May 15, 2008, in an apartment near Delhi, a 13-year-old girl named Arushi Talvar was found dead in her bedroom. Suspicion first fell on the family's live-in worker, Hemraj, who was missing. Then, the next day, his body was found on the terrace of the same building. The victims were now two, and the only real suspects left were Arushi's own parents, two respected dentists. From that moment, the case became less about evidence and more about theories. But the true horror of this one has no face, because the thing that destroyed any chance of justice here was the investigation itself. The crime scene was contaminated almost immediately. The terrace where the second body lay was not even searched for a full day. The case then bounced between the local police and two separate teams from India's federal agency, and those teams reached opposite conclusions. One cleared the parents. A later team turned around and built a case against them, largely on circumstantial reasoning, while the actual weapon was never found. So how did it end, if you can even call it an ending? In 2013, the parents were convicted and sentenced to life for the murder of their own daughter. Then, in 2017, a higher court acquitted them completely, ruling the evidence never came close to proving anything beyond reasonable doubt. They walked free after roughly 4 years in prison. And officially, to this day, the case is unsolved. 2 people were convicted and then unconvicted of the worst imaginable thing. A botched investigation erased any chance of the truth, and a 13-year-old girl still doesn't have an answer. Sometimes the most disturbing thing a story can do is refuse to end. Level 3. Citizen X. Citizen X from 1995 is about one of the most prolific killers in history, the Soviet murderer Andrei Chikatilo, and the years-long hunt to catch him. But the film is really about a system that kept getting its own way. Chikatilo was a married father of 2 and a former teacher, completely ordinary on the outside. Between 1978 and 1990, across the Rostov region, he murdered a horrifying number of victims. Many of them women and children he lured away from bus and train stations. He confessed to 56 killings, was tried for 53, and convicted of 52. For years, the investigators knew they were hunting one man, but the Soviet system made it impossible to say so publicly and gave them almost nothing to work with. But here is the fact that makes this case infuriating. He was caught in 1984. Police had him, but a blood test showed his blood was type A, while the killer's other samples were typed AB. So they let him go, insisting it was some rare medical quirk. Modern experts say it was simply bad forensic work. And because of that one mistake, Andrei Chikatilo walked back out into the world and kept killing for 6 more years. And it gets darker, because the failure had already cost an innocent life. Back in 1979, a man named Alexander Kravchenko was arrested for one of Chikatilo's very first murders, gave a confession under pressure, and was executed for it. An innocent man was put to death for a crime the real killer went on committing for over a decade. Chikatilo was finally arrested in 1990 and executed in 1994. He's long dead, but the innocent man killed in his place can never be brought back, and it's still one of the worst mistakes Soviet police ever made. Bhopal, A Prayer for Rain. Bhopal from 2014 dramatizes what is, by the numbers, the worst industrial disaster in human history. And the most disturbing thing about it is how cheap all those lives turned out to be. Just after midnight, going into December 3rd, 1984, a pesticide plant run by an American company in Bhopal, India, leaked around 30 to 40 tons of a deadly gas. It drifted invisible over neighborhoods full of sleeping families. The death toll is genuinely disputed, and you should hear the range. Official figures land around 3,800. Independent estimates run from 8,000 dead within the first 2 weeks to as high as 15,000 or even 25,000 over the years that followed. More than 500,000 people were exposed. But here is the part that turns a tragedy into something closer to a crime. According to multiple investigations, the safety systems meant to contain exactly this kind of leak had been shut down or left broken to cut costs. And after the gas killed thousands, the parent company settled the entire disaster in 1989 for $470 million. Divided across the victims, that comes out to something like $500 to $800 per person. That was the price. And the accountability matched the price. It took until 2010, 26 years, for anyone to be convicted. And when it happened, 7 employees got just 2 years each, the same penalty India uses for a fatal traffic accident. The company's American chief executive was arrested in Bhopal, released on bail within hours, flew out of the country, was declared a fugitive, and died a free man in 2014 at 92. And this is why the case should frighten you more than any slasher film. The chemicals abandoned at that site are still poisoning the local groundwater right now, decades later. Children are being born into it. The worst industrial disaster ever recorded was closed out with a fine and a couple of 2-year sentences, and the poison never actually left. Hotel Mumbai. Hotel Mumbai from 2018 recreates one of the most horrifying real events of this century, the 2008 Mumbai attacks, known in India simply as 26/11. Over roughly 60 hours starting on November 26, 2008, 10 gunmen, trained and directed from across the border, arrived in Mumbai by sea and hit the city in several places at once. A train station, a community center, and 2 luxury hotels. In total, around 166 people were killed and more than 300 were wounded. 4 of the attackers seized the Taj Mahal Palace Hotel, a 565-room landmark, and held it for the entire siege while parts of it burned. But here is the part the movie is really about. When the shooting started, many of the hotel's own staff, the waiters, the cooks, the managers, didn't run. They stayed behind to hide guests, to form human chains, to lead strangers out through kitchens and service corridors. According to accounts of that night, roughly half of the people killed inside the Taj were employees. People who could have saved themselves chose to protect the guests instead, and paid for it with their lives. Of the attackers, 9 were killed during the operation. 1 was captured alive, famously caught on the station's cameras with a rifle, and was later tried and executed in 2012. The Taj was rebuilt and reopened, and a memorial now honors the people who died there. So I want to leave you with a hard question, because the film puts it right in front of you. If you were working a shift when the gunman came in, do you think you would have stayed? Walked back into a burning building full of killers to lead frightened strangers out? Because the men and women of the Taj did exactly that, and most of us will never be tested the way they were. Level 4. The Magdalene Sisters. The Magdalene Sisters from 2002 is about a system that hid in plain sight in Ireland for most of the 20th century, the Magdalene laundries. And the reason it's so unsettling is that this is not ancient history. For decades, from the 1920s onward, women and girls in Ireland who were judged to be fallen, which could mean unmarried mothers, orphans, abuse victims, or simply girls considered too difficult, were locked away in institutions run by Catholic religious orders. Behind locked doors and iron gates, they worked without pay, mostly doing laundry, which is where the name comes from. According to the government's own 2013 report, more than 10,000 women passed through these places after 1922, and broader historical estimates reach around 30,000. But here is the fact that stops people cold when they first hear it. The last of these laundries stayed open until 1996, and the whole thing only really cracked open in 1993, when one of the religious orders sold off some of its land, and 155 bodies were exhumed from unmarked graves on the property, women who had died inside the system and been buried without names. In 2013, the Irish state finally issued a formal apology. The head of the government stood up and called it the nation's shame, and a compensation scheme paid out around 33 million euros to over 800 survivors. And today, the 4 religious orders that actually ran the laundries, that used these women as unpaid labor for decades, have refused to contribute a single euro to that compensation. The state said sorry, the women got a payment from taxpayers, and the institutions responsible have, to this day, kept their money and their silence. The Battle of Algiers. The Battle of Algiers from 1966 is so realistic that militaries around the world still screen it to study insurgency. It recreates the brutal fight for the city of Algiers during Algeria's War of Independence from France, and it refuses to let anyone off the hook. Between 1956 and 57, the Algerian independence movement waged an urban bombing campaign, planting bombs in cafes and public places used by French civilians. In response, France sent in paratroopers with sweeping powers and orders to crush the network by any means. The film shows both sides honestly, the young women slipping past checkpoints to plant bombs that would kill civilians, and the soldiers who answered with something the French state denied for decades. But here is where the true horror lives. France won the Battle of Algiers, and it won by making torture and extrajudicial killing into routine policy, then dressing the killings up as something else. Of tens of thousands of Algerians arrested, a French official at the time estimated that around 3,000 simply disappeared. A captured independence leader died in custody, and the official report claimed he had taken his own life in his cell. Decades later, a French general admitted in his own memoir that officers had executed him and staged the scene, and that torture had been systematic and approved from the top. And here is the reckoning, or the lack of one. Algeria did win its independence in 1962, so France won the battle and lost the war. But not a single French officer was ever punished for the torture. The general who confessed to it was only ever penalized for the crime of publicly admitting it. So I want to leave you with the exact question this film has forced on soldiers and governments for almost 60 years. Do you think a state is ever justified in using torture to stop terror, even in the cases where it actually works? Or does winning that way mean you have already lost the thing you were trying to defend? Nobody Knows. Nobody Knows, a Japanese film from 2004, is one of the quietest films on this entire list. And in some ways, it's the one that unsettles me the most, because it's based on something that really happened in Tokyo, a city of millions, where a group of children simply disappeared in plain sight. The film is based on a real case from 1988. A single mother left her children, 5 of them, alone in an apartment and essentially walked out of their lives, sending a little money now and then. The oldest, a boy of 14, was left to raise the younger ones. They lived like that, alone, for around 9 months. They ran out of money. They lived off convenience store leftovers. And the whole time, the adult world had no idea they were there. But here is the detail that makes this so quietly horrifying. Most of these children had never been registered at birth. They were not enrolled in any school. On paper, in one of the most organized societies on Earth, they barely existed. There were no records to check. no teacher to notice an empty desk, no system that even knew their names. That is how 5 children could live and struggle for the better part of a year in a busy Tokyo neighborhood, while, as the title says, nobody knew. The case only came to light because of a tip from the landlord, and by then one of the youngest children had died. The director made a very deliberate choice with the film. He softened it. He pulled back from the very worst of what happened and told a slower, sadder version. And maybe that was the only way anyone could stand to watch it at all. Because in the end, the mother is only half the story. The other half is a whole world of adults, neighbors, officials, strangers on the street, going about their lives on the other side of a thin apartment wall, while a group of children slowly ran out of everything, and no one ever thought to ask. Level 5. The Official Story. The Official Story from 1985 was the first Latin American film to win the Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film, and it did something dangerous. It was made in Argentina right as the country was crawling out of a nightmare, and it pointed straight at what that nightmare had done to its children. From 1976 to 1983, Argentina was ruled by a militia junta that waged what became known as the Dirty War against its own people. Anyone suspected of opposing it could be taken. The number of the disappeared is still argued over today. Human rights groups estimate around 30,000, while the officially documented count of named cases is closer to 9,000. And you should know both. People were taken to secret detention centers, killed, and their bodies hidden so thoroughly that many people were never found. But here is the part the film is really about, and it's one of the coldest things a government has ever done. Many of those taken were young pregnant women. The regime kept them alive just enough to give birth. Then, in many cases, the mothers were murdered, and their newborns were handed to families connected to the military, given false identities and raised as their own. The state erased its enemies, and then it kept their children, like spoils of a war that only one side was fighting. And this is where the story is still unfinished, right now. A group of grandmothers, the Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, has spent decades searching for those stolen children, who are now adults in their 40s and 50s. Using DNA, they've identified around 140 of them so far, people who grew up with no idea their real parents had been murdered, but they estimate there are around 500 in total, which means, as of today, there are roughly 350 people out in the world living ordinary lives who still don't know their real names, or that their whole identity was built on a lie. Black Friday. Black Friday from 2004 is an Indian film so explosive that a court blocked its release for nearly 3 years. It's about the 1993 Bombay bombings, and it does something brave. It refuses to treat that attack as the beginning of the story. On March 12, 1993, a coordinated series of bombs, around a dozen of them, tore through Bombay in a single afternoon, hitting the stock exchange, hotels, and crowded markets. 257 people were killed and around 1,400 injured. It was one of the deadliest attacks India had ever seen, planned by an underworld network operating from abroad. On the surface, it looks like pure terrorism, appearing out of nowhere. But the film places the bombings at the end of a longer, uglier chain of events. A few months earlier, at the turn of 1992 into 1993, Bombay had been torn apart by communal riots that killed roughly 900 people across the city's communities, with the dead falling disproportionately among its Muslim minority. Those riots followed the destruction of a mosque in another city, and according to a later official government commission, in places, the police were not just failing to stop the riots, they were part of them. The film lays all of this out and asks the audience to see the attacks inside its full history, not on its own. And here is where the justice landed, unevenly, as it so often does. After a marathon trial, around 100 people were convicted for the bombings, and one man was executed in 2015. But the actual masterminds fled the country and remain fugitives to this day. Meanwhile, for the earlier communal violence that came before it, the violence the commission said the police helped along, almost no one was ever held accountable. One atrocity got a hanging and 100 convictions. The one that came before it got nothing. And the cycle underneath it all, violence answered by violence, was never really closed. It was just paused. Waltz with Bashir. Waltz with Bashir from 2008 is unlike anything else on this list. It's a war documentary, but it's animated, and it's the director filming inside of his own broken memory. It circles around one of the darkest events of the 1982 Lebanon War, the Sabra and Shatila massacre. The director, Ari Folman, was a 19-year-old Israeli soldier during that war. Decades later, he realized he had almost no memory of a specific, terrible thing he had been near, so the entire film is his attempt to get that memory back, interviewing the men he served with, trying to reassemble what his mind had deleted. What he is circling toward is the massacre. Over roughly 2 days in September 1982, a militia entered a neighborhood and a refugee camp and killed a large number of civilians. The estimates are contested, ranging from around 800 to 3,500 people. But here is where the film turns the horror inward. The area was under Israeli military control at the time. The army didn't carry out the killings, but it let the militia in. And according to the record and the film, Folman's own unit fired flares into the night sky, lighting the area up while the massacre happened below. He never killed anyone, but he was one of the young men who, without fully understanding it, held the light. And a psychologist in the film suggests his memory erased the event precisely because some part of him felt as responsible as the men who did it. It settled like this. An official commission of inquiry in 1983 found the state indirectly responsible and named its defense minister as personally responsible for ignoring the obvious danger. He resigned that post, but no one from the militia that carried out the massacre was ever prosecuted, and the film ends the only way it honestly can. After 90 minutes of animation, in the final seconds, the drawing suddenly drops away and cuts to real footage of the aftermath. The made-up version stops. The real one is left standing, and that's where the questions run out. Level 6. Katyn. Katyn from 2007 was directed by the legendary Polish filmmaker Andrzej Wajda, and for him, the story is personal in the most painful way possible. The film is about the 1940 Katyn massacre and the 50-year lie that came after it. In the spring of 1940, on an order signed at the very top of the Soviet government, the secret police executed around 22,000 Polish military officers, policemen, and intellectuals, men taken prisoner after the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland. They were killed at several sites, the most famous being the Katyn forest. In a single operation, a government tried to erase the entire leadership class of a nation. But here is the part that turned a massacre into a 50-year wound, what Poles came to call the Katyn lie. When the mass graves were discovered during the war, the Soviet Union blamed Nazi Germany, and after the war, it forced communist Poland to keep repeating that lie. For 2 generations, Polish families weren't allowed to say out loud who had really killed their fathers and grandfathers. They couldn't mourn honestly, and for Wajda, this was his own life. His father, an army officer, was murdered in 1940. His mother waited, hoping he was alive, until her own death. Wajda later put it simply: his father was a victim of the massacre, and his mother was a victim of the lie. The truth took an unbelievably long time. It was only in 1990, half a century later, that the Soviet Union finally admitted its own guilt, and in 1992 that it released the secret execution orders. Wajda waited almost his entire life and made this film in his 80s, essentially to bury a father he had never been allowed to grieve. And history left one last cruel note. In 2010, a plane carrying the Polish president and dozens of officials to a ceremony marking the massacre crashed near that very forest, killing everyone on board. Even the act of remembering Katyn became another tragedy. Hotel Rwanda. Hotel Rwanda from 2004 is about one of the fastest and most horrifying genocides in modern history, the slaughter in Rwanda in 1994, and about one man who turned a hotel into a shelter while a country was destroyed around him. Beginning in April 1994, over roughly 100 days, extremist militias set out to exterminate Rwanda's Tutsi minority. The killing was done largely by hand, by neighbors against neighbors. The death toll is staggering however you count it. It's most often cited as around 800,000. with serious estimates ranging from around 500,000 to over 660,000, and Rwanda's own official figure exceeding 1 million. In the film, Paul Rusesabagina, the manager of a luxury hotel in the capital, uses bribes, connections, and sheer nerve to shelter around 1,268 people inside its walls and keep the killers at the gate. But here is the part that should make all of us uncomfortable, and it reaches far beyond one hotel. The world watched this happen and pulled back. The United Nations force on the ground was cut down to a token presence. Foreign countries sent troops in, but mostly just to evacuate their own citizens, and then left. According to the UN commander there, a few thousand properly backed soldiers could very likely have stopped the entire genocide, but they were never sent. Now, I have to be honest with you about the man at the center, because the real story got complicated. For years, Paul Rusesabagina was celebrated worldwide as a hero. More recently, some survivors have disputed his account, saying he exaggerated his role. At the same time, when he was lured back to Rwanda in 2020 and imprisoned on terrorism charges, human rights groups called it an unfair, politically motivated case against a man who had criticized the government. So both things hang in the air at once, and that leaves a genuinely hard question. Do you think the real story here is whether one hotel manager was truly the hero we were told he was? Or is the only thing that matters that 800,000 people were murdered while the rest of the world decided it wasn't their problem? Level 7. The Railway Man. The Railway Man from 2013 is based on the true memoir of a British man named Eric Lomax. And after everything else on this list, it's the one that offers something almost impossible. A way out. Lomax was a young British officer captured when Singapore fell to Japan in 1942. He was sent to work as a prisoner on the Thai-Burma Railway, the one history remembers as the Death Railway, where tens of thousands of Allied prisoners and conscripted laborers died from disease, starvation, and brutality. Lomax and a few others secretly built a small radio just to hear the news of the outside world. When it was found, along with a hand-drawn map, the military police accused them of spying, and Lomax was tortured. For the rest of his life, he was haunted most by the voice of the interpreter who had stood in the room, translating while it happened. But here is the turn that makes this film different from every other one here. Decades later, Lomax discovered that the interpreter, a man named Takashi Nagase, was not only still alive, but had spent his entire life consumed by guilt, doing acts of atonement, even helping build a temple of peace near the very bridge the prisoners had suffered to build. Lomax, still carrying his hatred and his trauma, traveled halfway around the world to confront the man who had helped break him. And here is where it ended, and it's almost unbelievable. When the two old men finally met in 1998 at the site of the railway, Nagase was trembling and repeated that he was so sorry, so very sorry. And Lomax, who had every reason on earth to want revenge, chose the other thing. He forgave him. The two of them became genuine friends and stayed friends until Nagase died in 2011. Eric Lomax died the next year at 93, having done what almost no one who has been through what he endured is ever able to do. After everything we've talked about today, one man looked at the person who had destroyed a part of his life and simply decided not to hate him anymore. The Zone of Interest. And we end with the quietest film of them all. The Zone of Interest from 2023 is one of the most quietly disturbing films ever made, and it earns that by almost never showing you anything at all. One quick note, because it matters. The film is loosely tied to a novel, but what it puts on screen is the real, named family of Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, using historical facts. So everything I'm about to tell you is real. Rudolf Höss ran Auschwitz for most of its existence. He was the man who turned it into one of the most efficient killing machines in human history, where around 1.1 million people were murdered, most of them Jews. The setting is what the film builds itself around. Höss and his wife and their 5 children lived in a comfortable villa with a garden, directly against the wall of the camp. His wife tended her flowers and called the place her paradise. The children played in a pool. The family wore clothes and used goods taken from the people being murdered a few meters away. But here is the horror of it, and it's a different kind than anything else here. The film almost never shows you the camp. You only ever hear it, distant sounds over the wall, a column of smoke behind a family picnic, a glow at night beyond the garden. The whole point is the ordinariness. A man goes to work, comes home, has dinner, tucks his children in, and his work is genocide. Evil here looks like a career, a commute, a mortgage, a nice house with a good school nearby. And it ends like this. After the war, Rudolf Hoss tried to disappear, living openly as a farm laborer under a false name. He was found, tried in Poland, and in 1947 he was hanged, on a gallows built for the purpose, a few dozen meters from the crematorium he had operated, right next to the villa where his children had played. So we finish all the way down here, with the most unsettling truth of them all. The family found it easy. They gardened and swam and laughed right up against that wall, because it was exactly high enough that they never quite had to look. Looking back at all 19 of these stories, from a plane wreck in the Andes to a villa in the shadow of Auschwitz, I think the thing that connects them is this. In almost every case, the movie is the version we can handle. The real story is the one nobody wants to put on a screen, because the truth does not have a soundtrack, or a hero shot, or an ending that makes you feel okay. I'm curious which of these you'll still be thinking about tonight. Was it those young men around the radio in the mountains, hearing that the search had been called off? Or was it that garden next to the wall, and how normal everyone in it managed to feel? Let me know in the comments, because I really do read them. And working on this one left me with a strange thought. Sometimes I wonder if a truly great film makes these things easier to look at than they should be. It gives horror a shape, a beginning and an end, when the real events just kept going, long after the credits. If you made it all the way to the bottom of this iceberg with me, thank you. That means a lot. And if you want more of these, make sure you're subscribed, because there is always another level. Thank you so much for hanging out with me till the very end. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.